Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Chicago Humanities Festival for the marvelous invitation to be here, and to Owen and Rona for the sponsorship today. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah. I know that the festival has been an essential part of the intellectual life of the city for more than 20 years, and it's a pleasure to and an honor to be part of it today. Thanks for coming. I'm going to be giving you a run-through of what really is the manifestation of a lifelong piece of research and the culmination of a lot of different directions in my own research. What I'm going to be talking about today is an area of what I refer to as birdwatching science. And that's science that consciously takes into account the familiarity one gains with birds in the wild with the scientific knowledge of the laboratory and the museum and controlled analysis. There's a trend in evolutionary biology to be afraid of claiming that one is actually interested in organisms. In fact, a lot of biologists want to be conservation biologists or behavioral ecologists and feel that bird watching is sort of denigrating the generality of their work. But I hope to acclaim that. Well, what is it about bird watching that actually contributes to science? Well, in short, I think it's a combination of ways of knowing. Bird watching is really about becoming familiar with the birds through firsthand knowledge, through your experience in the wild. And science, of course, is about the kind of things we can establish in a generalized or permanent or objective way. And you know, we don't really have a good explanation for these ways of knowing in English, but other languages do. So in French, we have two words for two verbs for to know, savoir and connaître. And savoir is to book knowledge, and connaissance is familiarity. And in Spanish, you have saber and conocer and wissen und kennen in German. And birdwatching science, natural history-inspired science, is the kind of science that hopes to unify or reconnect those two ways of knowing, our familiarity along with experiment. Now, I'm going to be communicating, in some cases, some controversial opinions in evolutionary biology. So I want to hopefully introduce you to how I got here and get you along on my journey. I'm going to start early with this. Yeah, this of course, I want to earn your credibility, and I hope that this earnest young man will help me do that. This is me in 7th grade or so, and well, there's lots of things I could say about this picture, but I'm going to start with the most important thing, which is the glasses. Right? Obviously, they're the centerpiece. And the glasses are important because when I got my first pair of glasses, it was in 4th grade, and within 4 or 6 months, I was a bird watcher. Somehow, the combination of the world coming into focus and my sort of nerdy curiosity, it settled on that first thing, and I've been moving forward ever since. And it was a life of birds, a life of birds that continues to roll out, often without real questions about what's coming next. But indeed, when I got to college and university, I realized that evolutionary biology was the area of science that was about those critical questions that I found most interesting. And so that led to a lot of field work, engaging with biology, behavior of birds in the field, and investigation of their evolution. So here I am, bearded and besweatered in the Andes in Ecuador, tape recording birds in the 80s. And that's led to lots of diverse research, and here's my equally cluttered office where I do these kinds of research today. So over the years, I've had the great pleasure doing all different kinds of research on birds, from the evolution and development of feathers, the origin of birds and dinosaurs, the physics and chemistry of bird coloration. In fact, the reason why I'm most frequently in Chicago is to take bird feathers, like these beautiful blue Cotinga feathers, over to Argonne labs, where we shoot them with X-rays and study their nanostructures and color. But over the years, Well, originally I thought that this was just sort of weird stuff that Rick is into, all the different projects. But in recent years, I've realized they're about one important thing, one big important thing, and that is the evolution of beauty. And by beauty, I mean not beauty as we regard it, though that's obviously motivating me in my research, but beauty as the birds see it. And so really today's talk is about the fact that birds are beautiful because they're beautiful to themselves, and that recognizing the agency of the aesthetic agency of birds gives rise to a fuller, richer account of their evolution. Now, to give you a taste of the challenge before us in evolutionary biology, I'm going to start with this recording. This is a video taken by Ed Scholes, my former grad student now at Cornell, of a superb bird of paradise. This is a male. Notice that the eye is black. We'll see that matters. This is a male displaying to a female who does all the nesting. What we have here is a complex combination of photonic structures, these beautiful blue feathers, surrounded by super black feathers. And if we listen carefully, we'll hear wing snaps. Right? So this is an extraordinarily rich display. In fact, I could probably talk for a whole hour about this 1 minute video. But it tells us many things, not least of all that the happy face evolved independently in New Guinea from 60s popular culture in America, right? But what this describes is, or challenges us, the breadth of complexity of beauty and the challenge to evolutionary biology to explain it. And now comes the problem. The problem is that most of my colleagues in evolutionary biology believe that complex displays of this nature are like a biological Match.com profile, a list of all the detailed pieces of information that mates need to know, like who are his people, does he come from a good egg, does he have a good diet, does he smoke, or what is he smoking, all the things that mates might need to know. And indeed, what this implies is that beauty is actually a kind of utility, a utility that provides information, objective information about quality. And somehow, my career, the way I've put together Wissen und Kennen, familiarity and experience, leads me to a conclusion that is at odds with this and to a very different view of the world. So that's what brings me here today. Now, in order to take this, what I'll describe as the aesthetic view, a fully aesthetic view of evolution, where beauty evolves not for its own sake, as well as for information, we need to embrace the subjective experience of animals as the topic of our science. That is, what it is like for an organism to actually experience the world at this time. So, for example, we have the bats, which see the world in sonar created pictures. We have the olfactory world of the mole, or even the electrical world of the more mirrored fish, which makes electrical fields that uses to navigate and also sing songs, electrical songs that vary in frequency and tempo, in pulse, like music. And of course, the birds. Now, it's not surprising, given these cognitive worlds of these organisms, that I've been studying the birds, because we communicate as well in the similar acoustic and color modes, and so they're at least one of the more interesting or easy to relate to. But there are entire other aesthetic worlds out there worthy of study, those of these other organisms. Now, to put this on a scientific framework, I have to inspire or create a real definition of what I mean by the aesthetic. And what I'm referring to, aesthetic evolution, is what I call an emergent consequence of three things in evolutionary biology: sensory perception, cognitive evaluation, and choice. And when these three things occur on a heritable substrate, we end up with a special kind of evolutionary change that I refer to as aesthetic. And this can occur, of course, mother birds and daddy birds are stuffing food into the mouths of their young, and as a result, they're making choices. They're perceiving, evaluating, and choosing which babies to feed, and as a result, we get the evolution of styles of cuteness, the varieties of beauty in the birds. And then, of course, pollinators are doing the same thing to create beautiful flowers. This bird song, the wood thrush that we hear, and the plumage of the cock of the rock are also functioning in sexual choice, and that's where we'll be spending most of today. Now, in order to bring beauty back into the sciences, I need a scientific definition. So like Immanuel Kant and other aesthetic philosophers, we have to endeavor to distinguish beauty from other kinds of mere attraction. In this case, so beauty, in this case, is not merely any attraction. It is a co-evolved attraction, where the form of desire and the form of the beautiful, the desirable, have shaped one another over evolutionary time. And I'm going to proposing that those kind of mechanisms can be both cultural or genetic. Now, this area of research did not originate here. It goes deeply back into evolutionary biology, and it was actually one of the primary discoveries of Charles Darwin. Of course, Darwin was famous for The Origin of Species, and in that book he published, made several spectacular discoveries, including the mechanism of adaptation by natural selection, the tree of life, or phylogeny. But he had, at the end of the book, several important problems. One, he had no theory of genetics and inheritance. He had no articulated theory of the origin of humans, and he had no explicit mechanism for the evolution of what he called intractable beauty. And in this case, Darwin really worried about his problems. Here he is in a letter to Asa Gray, just a year after the publication of The Origin. "The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick." And if we look he actually looks a little sick there, I think. And I think that speaks to Darwin's personal intellectual turmoil. Very conservative, socially conservative person with a revolutionary mind at a very conservative time. So he was fully understood the challenges of his ideas. But instead of, he did not stay in his same area. He wheeled around in a foxy, creative way, and in a little over 10 years published a second book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, in which he proposed an alternative or an additional theory or mechanism of evolution. That was sexual selection. And it had two main components: mating competition, often male-male competition, over control over mating opportunities of the other sex, and mate choice by one sex for mates of the other sex, or among both sexes. And it's really the mate competition or male-male competition that would give rise to the evolution of armaments, large body size, and weapons. And Darwin predicted that mate choice should give rise to ornament in nature, and that this process was distinct from natural selection. So in describing sexual selection, Darwin used explicitly aesthetic language. That is the language of everyday art and human experience. So he described mate preferences as an aesthetic faculty, a taste for the beautiful, or as standards of beauty. And he described ornament in nature as sometimes evolving, or that the most refined sorts of beauty may serve as a sexual charm and for no other purpose. And this outlines that indeed he saw this as distinct from evolution by natural selection, not adaptation. His theory was also coevolutionary, as I've said. In other words, the way in which there is a coevolutionary dance between beauty and preference for it. He described the male Argus pheasant as acquiring its beauty gradually through preference of females during many generations for more highly ornamented males, and the aesthetic faculty of females, capacity of females, advance through exercise or habit. So they change one another to establish a co-evolved norm of beauty. Now, Darwin was perhaps the most successful scientist of his day, but this argument was considered to be a great failure. Of course, more specifically, male-male competition was so close to the cultural perceptions of the day that it was immediately adopted. But his theory of mate choice, particularly that female mate choice was a force in nature, was almost universally rejected. He had many critics, and many of those critics were explicitly misogynistic in their tone, but his most ardent and successful critic was Alfred Russel Wallace. And Wallace here, in the competition of seriousness for the white beards, He started very critical of the idea, and that critique just grew. And it was so successful that he's credited with having killed the theory of sexual selection for over a century. It wasn't until really 1971 that the theory came back to become a mainstream idea in evolutionary biology. However, when you look at Wallace's writing in detail, he was unable to completely reject the theory. And he said in a section, Natural Selection Neutralizing Sexual Selection, he described what would happen if it were to occur. And he said, the only way in which we can account for the observed facts, ornament in nature, is by supposing that color and ornament are strictly correlated with health, vigor, and general fitness to survive. Now, this is ironic because Wallace is the person that's credited with having killed sexual selection for a century. And yet here he is articulating essentially the Biomatch.com profile upon which the entire literature in sexual selection is based today. That is, this sentence would be essentially at home in most papers on this topic in the field today. So how does that work? Well, it turns out that his victory was in part rhetorical. He took the elements that he liked of Darwin's theory, renamed them natural selection, and then rejected sexual selection as whatever was left. And what was left? What was left was the aesthetic. What was left was the idea that beauty could evolve for its own sake. So Darwin and Wallace fought about this for a number of years. Darwin didn't give an inch until he died in 1883. And then in 6 years after Darwin's death, Wallace published the book Darwinism, in which he states in the introduction, even in rejecting that phase of sexual selection, depending on female choice, I insist on the greater efficacy of natural selection. This is preeminently the doctrine. I claim for my book the position of being the advocate of pure Darwinism. So here, Darwin has been dead for only 6 years, and Wallace is claiming to be more Darwinian than Darwin. Right? Well, it's been 130, 140 years, and I'm still pissed. And I hope that you will be too. Because what happened was a laundering of and an obfuscation of the true complexity of Darwin's and creativity of Darwin's thought and contributions in evolutionary biology, right? And so Wallace may have lost the battle over the credit for the description or the invention or the discovery of adaptation by natural selection. But he won the war over what evolutionary biology would become in the 20th century, which was a field based on the insistence of the greater efficacy of natural selection, a field dominated by the field of the view that I'll refer to as adaptationism. Now, in a hat tip to the festival's view on belief, I want to explicitly make statements about the role of belief in this debate. So here I'm contrasting the Wallacean view, the adaptationist view, with the Darwinian view. And the Wallacean view, even today, is based on a belief, and I think it's almost a faith-based belief, in the singular power of adaptation by natural selection. Adaptation as a strong force that determines all the interesting issues in evolutionary biology, and that sexual selection is a form of natural selection. This is a view that explains away individual agency, and here, synthesis and reductionism are considered to be fundamental scientific values. So this is a worldview based on the unity of science and on reductionism, and I think in a faith-based way. Now, we all have to make, in science, some assumptions. We have to believe things before we can do an experiment or make an observation. To do genetics, you have to assume things about the structure of DNA have already been established. But when you assume, as part of the foundation of your research, something that should actually be the subject of it, then your narrowness, your beliefs, can get in the way of the science. And so what I'm really proposing is that an alternative view based on a legitimately Darwinian perspective, an aesthetic view, based on the acceptance of multiple evolutionary mechanisms, will give us a richer and more fulfilling picture of the world. In this case, sexual selection is distinct from natural selection. This recognizes individual agency of choice as both the causal form of evolution and as the locus of research, and argues for pluralism and recognition of emergent processes as fundamental scientific values. Now, at this point in my talk, I would often veer off into detailed descriptions of population genetic models. I'm going to spare you that. And I hope to give you an analysis, a contrast between the Wallacean and the Darwinian, the aesthetic and the adaptive, with a comparison of the beauty, the origin of beauty to the origin of the value of money. So let's compare the value of beauty to the value of money. Now, originally, under the gold standard, a dollar had value because it stood in lieu of a tiny piece of the gold in Fort Knox. Right? So under the gold standard, the value of money comes not from the money itself, but from some extrinsic object, some extrinsic benefit, the gold. So the value of money is extrinsic under the gold standard. Now, all currencies from dollars to bitcoins in the world are now off the gold standard. And under the gold standard, the value of money arises, as Samuelson described it, as a social contrivance. It's shared opinion, belief perhaps, that creates, among individuals, that creates the value of money. And so in this case, without the gold standard, the value of the dollar is the dollar itself. It's intrinsic. So in contrast, my biological colleagues are on the gold standard. They believe that the value of the peacock's tail is not the beauty of the peacock's tail, but other information that it communicates, like good genes or direct benefits, the information about sexually transmitted diseases, or about the number of worms in a territory, etc. Right? But under the Darwinian view, under the fully aesthetic view, includes the possibility that the value of beauty is intrinsic, that evolves merely for its own sake. Now, the concept of a social contrivance and all the population genetics that I skipped over are not great marketing tools. So how do I get this idea across? Well, my proposal is that beauty happens. And what this means is, again, when there's the sensory perception, cognitive evaluation, and the social opportunity for choice in the context of heritable we get beauty will evolve. Right? Or more explicitly, co-evolve. And that this is an independent, or can be an independent form of evolutionary biology. Now, the gold standard motivates even more explicit discussion for how we should proceed. So my colleagues, like this leprechaun here, believe that the peacock's tail is like a rainbow leading to a pot of gold, an extrinsic benefit. And that pot of gold is, in his case, is filled with good genes. And I should put worms in there, but I couldn't find a cartoon of a worm that fit there. Worms, other good stuff, right? And so the question, as we proceed in science and ask, how do we decide between the Wallacean, the adaptive, and the aesthetic views of evolution? Well, the way we do it is by going to nature and testing this hypothesis. And how we do it? Well, if a leprechaun came to you and said, well, at the end of the rainbow, there's a pot of gold, you'll have to ask yourself, well, what's the scientific conclusion? Who has the burden of proof? Well, you would tell the leprechaun, I hope, show me the money, right? In fact, the idea that the beauty of the rainbow is merely intrinsic, merely the rainbow itself, is, I think, the preferred hypothesis, right? And so I hope with this leprechaun hat on Wallace that you will never forget the idea of the leprechaun in Israel. And so what I'm proposing really is that beauty happens is the null model. That is, beauty happens, the non-adaptive view of beauty is our expectation as we go to nature about how evolution should work. So let's see how beauty happens. This is an Argus pheasant. It's a South Asian pheasant. This is a male about 6 feet long. And this video is taken in a zoo, but it shows an incredibly complicated version of avian beauty. As you see, the female, he's approaching the female after doing a series of stamping and then what they call lateral displays. There's the female. And in a moment, he'll present himself to the female and transform himself in a really, truly stunning way. What we have here is, these are the primary feathers, and these are the secondary feathers, the wing feathers. And on those wing feathers are a series of spherical spots with bright white highlights on the top and black mascara smudges on below. So like a shiny apple, like the specular reflections off a shiny apple, it will give the impression that light illuminating the spots from above is creating a three-dimensional perception. This is an optical illusion. Now, interestingly, William Beebe, when he first saw this display and watched it in the wild, he concluded that as he called it, the little hen was obviously, the aesthetic content of this display was completely wasted on that little hen. And of course, he's in a foxhole in the ground in Borneo, having waited, worked 6 months to see this. Of course, he's having a religious experience, and he looks at the hen and says, she's totally unimpressed. So he rejected Darwin's theory. But I think he got it totally wrong, because the co-evolutionary model predicts that behind every elaborate ornament, there's an equally elaborate cognitive concept, a cognitive standard by which choice is made. So this female is sitting there so, if you will, stoically, because she is a connoisseur. She's like the most elite collector in any gallery in the city, standing there looking and asking, do I like that? Right? And so she's the agent that gave rise to this. So it impresses us, but in fact, extreme beauty is a consequence of extreme failure, extreme aesthetic failure. Right? Most of these males in these Argus pheasants probably never mate in their lives. Right? And the equivalent is that most poems that are written really suck. And why is that? That's because the stringency, the aesthetic standards that are used to judge them are so strong, and that the achievements of great poems are so amazing that they allow that it's even possible. Right? And so aesthetic extremity is about both the co-evolution of standards and extreme failure. Now, if we look at these things, we learn more about the detail of beauty. Here's a close-up of the feathers. There's that white highlight, the dark black mascara smudge that gives it its three-dimensionality. But this is obviously an optical illusion. But there is actually another illusion. If we look at the feather, these long feathers, which are almost, over 2 feet long, the spots start out small at the base and get larger toward the tip. You could imagine that's just sort of allometry, scaling with the feather itself. But indeed, if you look at these spots from the perspective of the female, you see that as they move away, they stay the same size. So there's a second dimension of optical illusion here, a forced perspective, so that the balls that are further away appear to be the same size as the ones that are closer to her, so that she sees essentially 300 golden balls all the same size floating in the air. Right? And so those advocates of extrinsic value of beauty have to ask themselves, how many objects have to be in that pot of gold in order to make this all possible? Right? Well, beauty is not only diverse, it's innovative. Right? And here is some work we've done on mechanical sounds, non-vocal communication in mannequins. These are polygynous lekking birds that do courtship displays. The females choose among available mates and do all of the nesting. So in this case, in the Manicus genus, they've evolved mechanical sounds. So we're going to see a male jumping around between branches, making a series of snaps with his wings, and then also kind of a Bronx cheer. And then we'll see some high-speed video. So here's the... And here's how he does it in slow-mo. He's slapping the top surfaces of wings together to make that snap. Now here's the Bronx cheer coming up. Here's bam, 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 bam. And so these muscle movements are some of the fastest vertebrate muscle movements ever described, nearly as fast as a rattlesnake, which is also acoustic. Now, so that's an entirely novel form of communication. Birds have been singing since the Jurassic, and indeed, these guys have suddenly decided that vocal sound is not good enough, that there's a new form of beauty, a kind of mechanical sounds. Here's another addition to that. If we could turn up the volume a little bit, that'd be great. This is the club-winged manakin from northwestern Ecuador. And that little violin-y-like sound is actually a wing song. He's making it with his feathers. Now, it took us 20 years to figure out how they do this. And here it is in a nutshell. Here's some high-speed movie by Kim Bostwick. showing that the feathers of the secondary feathers of the wings that are making the sound are oscillating over the back, colliding with each other in the middle, and then moving outward, vibrating at 1,000 or 100 cycles per second. But the sound is 1,500 cycles per second, so 15 times faster than that. How does that work? Well, what Kim was able to establish was that these club-winged feathers that give its common name interact in a special way called stridulation. It turns out the bent fifth secondary, the blade on the fifth secondary, bends over and rubs against these series of bumps on the sixth secondary, causing that feather to vibrate, to oscillate at the frequency of the sound, like bowing a violin or running your fingers over a comb. This is a kind of stridulation, unique in the birds, but found broadly in insects. Now, in subsequent work, Kim has shown not only innovation in mannequin communication, but answered a universal problem in the evolution of beauty. She's discovered that beauty is not only skin deep. In order to make those beautiful songs, the males have had to revolutionize broadly the kind of morphology of the body. So here's a CAT scan of a skeleton, of spirit specimen of a club-wing mannequin, and here's a cross-section showing that the humerus, the radius, and the ulna, the wing bones, are actually solid like ivory. That's an interesting thing because every bird has a hollow ulna, has hollow wing bones. In fact, the wing bones, hollow wing bones, are so ancient they go back to even T-Rex has a hollow ulna, right? So in order to create the sounds that females prefer, they have revolutionized, transformed their own anatomy. And she was able to show this with CAT scans of the ulna of the club-wing mannequin and then other mannequins. These are standard bird ulnas. They look, they're hollow. They look actually just like a flute. Actually, the oldest musical instrument known was an ulna of a bird carved into a flute. So these are the tubular flute shapes, and this is the extraordinary shape. So this is interesting. But it could always be interpreted that the high cost of making this ulna and the ability, the cost of flying afterwards, could be interpreted as an honest, informative handicap, as a kind of ante that makes it impossible for any individual to mimic this sound. So I decided to investigate further, and I asked, what about female club-wing mannequins? What do their ulnas look like? Well, it was truly a challenge to find specimens to do this because the animals are so rare in museums. In fact, there are no skeletons of this species in any museum in the world. But we were able ultimately to find them, and here we found that female club-wing mannequin ulnas are similar in shape to male club-wing mannequin ulna, and completely divergent. What's interesting, of course, is that they are paying the costs of sexual display, but they never perform those displays. They never sing a wing song. In fact, they have absolutely normal feathers in every way. Now, this is interesting because the handicap model, the idea that the costs are informative, cannot apply to her. How does this work? Well, I think this is an example of the evolution of decadence, that sexual selection has actually made everybody in the population worse at survival and lower in fecundity as a result of selection for beauty. Right? How would it happen? Well, females, by choosing on those male songs that they love, would of course be selecting for males with bizarre ulna shapes. But it turns out that the ulna and other wing bones develop in the embryo before it has any differentiated sex, before it becomes male or female. So they can't help but drag themselves and their daughters also into this state of lower physical function. It turns out that the female's daughters will also inherit these odd wing bones, but that cost will be traded off by the sexual advantage of having attractive male offspring. So in theory, there's nothing to keep this whole process from going all the way to extinction. Now, I was talking to a journalist who said, you seem to really enjoy that idea. And I had to admit, well, maybe a little. But why is this so important? It turns out that this is important that when we can see adaptation by natural selection and aesthetic evolution by sexual selection acting in opposite directions, that we really realize that we must intellectually recognize them as separate evolutionary forces in order to do the appropriate job of describing the natural world. Now, all of this work is basically about the agency, the product of the agency of choice. the fact that individuals make those choices and that they are driving this aesthetic coevolutionary process. But I want to talk about another discovery that came out of this aesthetic view of life, and that is about the troubling but fascinating topic of duck sex. This is really, yeah, we'll get there. This is a disturbing topic because it's basically about sexual violence in the wild. But what we discover about the responses to sexual violence, I think, are really illuminating and in an interesting and new way. So my work on duck sex is actually all collaborative with Patricia Brennan, now a professor at Mount Holyoke College. And she came to my lab with an interest in the evolution and function of avian genitalia. And I thought, well, I've never worked in that end of the bird before. I'll learn a lot of interesting things. But in fact, what we did learn transformed my view of evolutionary biology in a really fundamental way, and became a critical part of this story. Well, what happens? Well, it turns out that I'm going to go very rapidly, but to summarize, the duck biology, most ducks form pairs, pair bonds, and which the female chooses a mate based on ornament, like the green head and the quack, quack, quack. But there is also a lot of forced copulation, sexual violence and coercion, often organized in socially, that is, sort of in gangs of males. And this is very harmful to females, both directly and also can lead to death. It's made possible by a result that the birds actually, or the ducks, actually still have a penis. This is a little-known secret of evolutionary biology. It turns out that the penis evolved in the common ancestor of reptiles and mammals, and it has been retained in most reptiles, lost in most birds, but retained in ducks. It is a remarkable structure and odd in many ways. One of them is remarkable in size. This is the Guinness Book of World Records holder for the largest penis for its body size, the Argentine lake duck. So Patricia Brennan, maybe it was not surprising that it took a woman biologist to come in and say, you know, what's with that? What is that thing really doing? And that's where we are. We need some background in the biomechanics and anatomy of the duck penis. Its bizarre structure. As you can see already, it's counterclockwise coiled. It does not have an enclosed urethra. It has a groove, an external groove called the sulcus, which is open when it's not inflated, but as you'll see, closed and functions very well. It has lymphatic instead of vascular erection, which means that the erection mechanism is instantaneous, rather, and indeed, the penis never becomes stiff. In this case, intromission, or entry into the female, and erection are the same single process, and it lasts very, very quickly. And then, in addition, the penis comes in ribbed, spiky, and even toothy varieties, which are of interest. So the next slide, well, in biology, we aim to change lives, and the next slide will change your life if you're not prepared, because you can't forget this, but this is a high-speed movie of a duck penis erecting. If you don't want to see it, then try to keep your eyes closed. This is taken at a duck farm, and believe me, this is actually a discovery from, 2010, brand new discovery. Here we have the penis is everting. This is at 500 frames per second. This whole thing takes a third of a second. The penis evolves initially from the base, and you can see that sulcus works just fine. Thank you. So that whole thing takes a third of a second. And you can see by we're using the metric side of the ruler. That means we're doing science here. Okay, not here, we're over here. Okay. So what does that thing do? Well, what we discover is, what Patty discovered essentially is that there is an antagonistic coevolution between the structure and size and ornamentation of the surface of the penis and the vaginal structure of the female. So when in species where there is very low frequency of forced copulation, the vaginal morphology is very simple. But in species with high rates of sexual coercion, the male evolves a very elaborate penis and the female evolves a convoluted vaginal structure. Let's look at that in more detail. It turns out that this consists of a series of blind pouches or dead-end cul-de-sacs at the base of the vagina, and then upstream of that, a series of spirals, but they are clockwise spirals. They are anti-sense to the direction of the penis. So the females literally have evolved an anti-screw device in their anatomy. right? And this is very successful because, in fact, in species where 40%, 50% of the copulations are forced, only 2 to 5% of the offspring in the nest will be extra pair. And what that means is that these females have a 98% successful birth control method to prevent its fertilization during forced copulation. So that's FDA approvable right there, right? So, right? So we wanted to try to demonstrate this, and the way we did it was to create glass tubes from the Yale glass blowing shop to try to give mechanical challenges to the ducks. This is a straight tube. This is a counterclockwise tube in the shape of a male. This is a clockwise tube with the same diameter and the opposite sense. And here's a dead-end cul-de-sac. And what we established that males erect their penises into these just fine, but they are prevented from successfully erecting their penises into these over 80% of the time. So we have good evidence that these materials, that these vaginal structures have evolved to prevent intromission during forced copulation. What this all means is that sexual autonomy, freedom of choice, matters to animals. It's not just an idea invented by suffragettes and feminists in the 19th and 20th centuries, but is an evolved feature of social sexual species in the wild. Right? How would that evolve? Well, it turns out that when the female gets the male she likes, with the green head and the quack, quack, quack she loves, then her offspring will inherit those traits that are attractive and that other females have co-evolved to prefer as well. Right? That's the aesthetic advantage that drives the evolution by mate choice. However, if she's forcibly fertilized, then her offspring will either inherit a random trait or one that she's explicitly rejected, which means that they will be less attractive to other females. And that will be an indirect or genetic cost to sexual violence. So any innovation, any mutation in behavior or anatomy that allows her to further her freedom of choice will evolve because it is reinforced by aesthetic normativity, the shared opinions about what is attractive among females. Right? I think of this as a profoundly feminist discovery in evolutionary biology, not one that comes from a political or cultural assumptions, but discovery that issues that are vital to human culture actually have broad evolutionary applicability. Sexual autonomy, right? Now, this leads in many cases to a damaging arms race, a lot of damage between males and females, a lot of wasted energy, but I want to briefly point out another opportunity, and that is, luckily, the diversity of birds provides us with lots of ways to think about sexual autonomy once we begin to do so, and that is the Bowerbirds. Now, the Bowerbirds are a fascinating polygynous group from Australia and New Guinea. Like many of the birds we've been seeing, the female does all the nesting and visits among various displaying males and chooses a mate. But the mates here, the males, build an aesthetic structure, the bower, which is not a nest. It's essentially a seduction theater. Right? And it has architecture, and he ornaments it with all sorts of interesting objects. In this species, blue objects that can be blue feathers or even blue trash, like bottle caps, etc. Right? So the bower itself has architecture. It is an aesthetic structure, but it also has an additional feature we'll get to. Now, this is a great bowerbird from northeastern or northwestern Australia. It's a picture I took myself, and this male has ornamented his bower with fossils. So the species in general uses white objects like bone or pebbles or sticks. But these guys are very near a cliff face overlooking the ocean, where in the middle of the cliff face there's a stratum of about a half a meter that includes these bright white fossils. So when this male is singing at the top of his tree, he's literally saying, "Do you want to come over and see my fossil collection?" Right? Now, as a museum curator, I somehow really relate to this guy, right? But what happens in the display, this is the male, but what happens during the display is he'll sit out front and he'll do a series of displays with the objects, and the female will sit in the middle. And that's where we can see the actual complete function of the bower, because if the male chooses to sexually coerce or attack the female, to try to force copulation before she's prepared, he has to go around the back. She's protected by these walls, which gives him and her an opportunity to pop out the front. So it's an aesthetic structure, but it's one that completely preserves her sexual autonomy. It protects her from being sexually manipulated or coerced. right? This is an elaborate aesthetic protection from date rape. As a result, she can get as close as she wants, inches away, and see all this stuff for as long as she likes and make her choices. Well, what do Bowerbirds do with their sexual agency? They make choices for beauty. So the Bowers elaborate in incredible ways, like these maypole structures and all the diversity of the fibers. What this shows is that freedom of choice begets beauty, right? And that's, I think, another fundamental implication. Now, before we close, I want to mention these unusual birds. These are mannequins. This is, there is one female and 5 males. By the end of this video, there'll be 7. Only one of those males will copulate with the female, if she chooses. She could go and actually choose another whole group, right? So they will dance like this for minutes and minutes and minutes. These partnerships last for decades. And those beta males, and my Greek alphabet doesn't go far enough to describe all, they are hoping someday to inherit the perch, right? This is a kind of pre-sexual cooperation, and in fact, this genus has reflects the most extreme sexual selection ever measured in nature. Right? So what's going on? Well, the males are cooperating because the females demand it. Female choice can transform maleness in ways that further their autonomy. Why would females want to choose a mate on the basis of a display by a cooperating group of 7 blue males? Why not? Right? This is like being a judge at a team male pole dancing competition. And not surprised, the award goes to the Brazilian team. This is the 7. Now we got 7 males. This is a kind, again, of aesthetic remodeling, the use of male choice or the use of female choice to further female autonomy. And actually, in subsequent work by David McDonald on this group, and he has showed that the most successful males are the ones that are most connected and have the greatest centrality to the social network. It's not about dominance. It's about how many friends you have. And so I call this bromance before romance. And it's just a reflection of how that can be transformed. Now, I hope I've given you a good view of the aesthetic evolution, and I should go to questions, but I'm going to be bad boy, and I'm going to give you 3 minutes, a very small nutshell description of the last third of the book. Now, this is all about animals, but why did I write the book? Well, one of the reasons I write the book is to talk about the evolution of human sexuality. And one of the reasons is because the adaptationist view, I think, has done so much damage to how we think about it. But I want to give you just a nutshell of what we're describing. Here's, and of course, if we're talking about human sexuality, I've been talking about bird sex my whole career. It's like, this is new for me. So what am I going to put up here? God help us, video? I don't know. So I'm going to rely on my old pal, the dry professorial bullet point list. So here we go. If that makes it easier. First of all, of course, it's complicated. Right? Human sexuality involves male-male competition, female-female competition, male choice, female choice, mutual mate choice, sexual conflict, et cetera, and culture. And it's not surprised that we get it so often so wrong, right? It's important. It's important to get the science of sexuality correct because I think the adaptationist view has transformed the way we think about ourselves and our bodies, especially the world that children grow up in. So I hope someday that these views are reflected right in the pages of Teen Vogue in a way that really changes how people think about themselves. Third, it's aesthetic. The adaptive ornament view, the Biomechanics view is not well supported. Next, it's pleasurable. And believe it or not, when the current evolutionary biology does not really have an explicit explanation of the evolution of sexual pleasure, especially the big evolutionary conundrum, the female orgasm. So there's a whole chapter on the evolution of orgasm that I think the aesthetic view provides a new solution to. I think that human evolution has deeply involved this process of aesthetic remodeling, the advance of female autonomy through female mate choice. And one of the examples, I think, is the reduction of canine weapons. Obviously, politically today, we want to know, how do you get guys to give up their weapons? And the evolutionary answer is that you do it through female choice, through mate choice. And our direct sister species males have deadly weapons in their faces that human males lack. And the question is, how do they get that way? Well, I think the individuals that are advantaged are females, and so it's really through female choice that happened. And then lastly, it's diverse. No description or study of human sexuality would be appropriate if it did not account for the variation in human sexual preferences. And so I attempt this in a new, non-adaptive way, and I think that the evolution of same-sex preference and same-sex behavior is a fundamental part of avian biology, and it's one that I think I can incorporate into the aesthetic view. So thanks very much for your attention, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'll answer any questions you have. Thank you.
I have a question. So for the female-male coevolution of the genitalia, so it's clear to me how the male allele would be chosen for if he's successful. But what I'm not sure about is how the female allele would be chosen for if she avoided. Does that make sense? So if she avoids a male, how does her allele...
Well, they don't have any way of... since they're laying eggs, and they lay those eggs without any knowledge of the identity of the father. Right. So they can't control that. So they're basically, we know that the only way they can get this huge bias toward in successive copulations is by preventing fertilization from extra-pair copulation. So they're just able anatomically to prevent intromission and prevent that sperm from being deposited close enough to the eggs to fertilize them.
Next question in the back.
Yes, you mentioned obviously visual characteristics, sonar characteristics, movement, but some birds have acute sense of smell. Yeah. Is there an aesthetic attraction in that realm?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating new area. It turns out that because of the size of the olfactory lobes in the brain, people have thought that birds don't smell that well. Well, obviously vultures, New World vultures, smell really well. They find their food in the forest, rotting meat, through olfaction. It's now being discovered in lots of things. The best is the parakeet auklet, which is a little puffin relative that lives up in the Aleutians and has little orange structures around it, and it smells during the breeding season only like nectarines, no, tangerines. And it turns out that orange little thing looks just like a tangerine, and it smells, it's the exact molecule of tangerines. So we know that they do this during the breeding season, and so, but that's a brave new world. We don't know much about the olfactory aesthetics of birds.
We have another one down here.
Yeah.
Not knowing much about your field, I presume that what you propose is somewhat revolutionary.
I hope so.
What do your more intelligent opponents say?
Yeah, I can't characterize the response of my colleagues because I'm not getting a lot of it. It's mostly crickets, silence. I think that means they don't really have well-formed. They don't want to change, and they don't really have well-formed opinions. Also, people don't read anymore, too, so that's kind of a problem. But the most I get are you don't have the right null model. You know, beauty happens. I don't have the right null model. I'm right that they need a null model. They're troubled by this. It doesn't keep them from publishing the same old methods they've always been using, but they know it's a problem. So narrow issues in the science. But I think that one of my goals is to help recruit new researchers into the field of biology to get in with the aspiration of doing work like this. And that's how intellectual change will happen.
I'll take the last two questions, one right here and one down stage.
I'm wondering if there's something like a mullet of the bird world.
Something like? A
mullet of the bird world. Your emphasis on preference, on choice, on sensory perception, all suggest to me the idea of culture.
Yes.
And I'm wondering to what extent we can say that the aesthetic norms are socially transmitted. Yeah.
With appropriate apologies to the Chicago Humanities Festival, birds are overloaded with culture. approximately half the species of birds of the world learn their songs from other conspecific birds. That's all of Oscine songbirds, hummingbirds, and parrots, and a few other things. And so what that means is that they have culture. The songs live longer than the individuals that invented them, right? And so there's actually work by Derry Berry, now at Tulane, where she took recordings of a population of white-crowned sparrows from 30 years before and from contemporary. And she did playback experiments, and she showed that the 30-year-old recordings were less successful at soliciting sexual interest from females or territorial defense responses from males. So basically, they were mullets. I didn't think to describe them as mullets, but I will now. Thank you.
That does conclude our program for today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.